Hey listeners, last year was our 15th year of the best in food storytelling. As we head into 2025, we're kicking off a contest in collaboration with the podcast series Feast and Harmony and Sixth Man, where you have the opportunity to win a 4-night cruise for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, a food, wine, and spirits festival at sea. When you donate to HRN, you'll be entered for the chance to win a porthole cabin for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, sailing May 5th through 9th, 2025, from Miami to Cozumel, Mexico on Norwegian Gem. You'll also support another year of great food storytelling with a portion of your donation going toward disaster relief for the food and beverage communities within Western North Carolina and Southern California. This cruise is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for culinary adventurers, featuring top celebrity chefs including Jonathan Waxman, Antonio Lafaso, Robert Irvine, and many, many more. There's a myriad of experiences such as restaurant takeovers, live food and mixology demos, themed parties, and more. To enter your chance to win, please visit heritageradionetwork.org/cruise. Terms and conditions apply. You must be 21 or over to enter. That's heritageradionetwork.org/cruise.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Josh Bergstrom. We'll talk to Josh about Oregon wine, Bergstrom, and more. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Josh Bergstrom is a second-generation Oregon winemaker. His dad emigrated from Sweden as a teenager to Portland, eventually becoming a surgeon and later buying property in the Willamette Valley. After receiving a postgraduate degree in viticulture and enology in Beaune, France, Josh joined his dad in 1999, establishing Bergstrom Wines on what is now over 70 acres of estate vineyards in the Dundee Hills, Chalaham Mountains, and Ribbon Ridge. Josh makes beautiful, cool climate Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and some Syrah biodynamically. Welcome to the Grape Nation, Josh.
Thank you very much.
So we're talking to Josh remotely via our Zencaster app. Both Josh and I are sitting in front of computers. Josh, where are you right now?
Well, thank you for having me. Super pleased to be here. I'm sorry we missed each other in New York.
I'll tell everyone about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was in New York with my oldest son for a sales trip last week, and you and I were supposed to meet at Wilson Daniels headquarters.
Right.
And then, Oregon, especially Northwest Oregon, near Portland and where we live, near the winery, had a huge ice storm and windstorm. And so my wife was by herself on top of a mountain on our farm, and I had to get home. So we missed the opportunity to sit together, but I'm happy to be with you here today. I'm at the winery. We are bottling today. We're bottling our 2023, which is our 25th vintage, Old Stone Chardonnay, Seagrid Chardonnay, Rosé, which we sell primarily DTC at our tasting room, and then some Pinots and our Syrah. So.
Very cool. So I guess your wife sent up the smoke signals and said, "Get your ass back here," right?
Well, we live on a mountain that's surrounded by old growth timber, and so when they start swaying and cracking, you get a little worried. So yeah.
So just a couple last things on that. It's always more fun to do a interview in person. Not that not in person is the end all, but it's a better dynamic. And the other thing was, and we're not doing it, but we'll do it another time, is usually when I sit with somebody, we could sit there and, taste some wine and talk about it. We
Sure.
didn't have enough time, to have wine or whatever set up, but we're going to talk about the wines a lot. So I want you to help me set up, who you are, where you're at, and how it all started. So help me with a brief history of the winery. Your parents, sort of have an interesting journey. So, tell me about that and how they, got to where they are and, what you did. You had a path. I mentioned a little of it in the intro. So tell me, give me the genesis of Bergstrom Wines.
Yeah. So Bergstrom Wines was founded by my mom and dad, John and Karen Bergstrom. And I usually always reference my father's immigration story because I think it really sets the groundwork for what we're doing today. It's my father was born and raised in a northern Swedish agricultural community. They had a communal household where my grandmother Sigrid was the switchboard operator for the community that was in their house. And,
That's funny.
there were 6 or 7 family members living in the house, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no cotton clothing. They farmed potatoes, they fished, they hunted moose, they had animals.
Wow.
And at the age of 12, my father had to take out a loan because his stepdad would not give him the money to buy an axe and a saw so that he could cross country ski to the logging camps where he would help earn money for the family. So, my father's parents stopped paying for his education after the 5th grade, and education was something that my father's always strived for, and he always read voraciously as a kid, and he read a lot of Western authors, books like James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans and such. So he had this Western ideal, this Western dream, and wanted to escape the life that he had, and was very fortunate at the age of 17 that his aunt and uncle, who lived in Portland, Oregon, who had already immigrated ahead of him, sent a sponsorship letter to his cousin. And she was too scared to go, and he was next in line. So at the age of 17, he got on a steamship in Oslo, Norway, and traversed the Atlantic and came through New York Harbor. I always love telling my father's story when I'm in New York because, I'm right there.
Right.
And, like many immigrants before him and of his era, he came through New York Harbor, saw the Statue of Liberty, flew directly to Portland, Oregon, where, he went to Cleveland High School day one, not speaking English, and graduated student body president. And then got into Ivy League schooling because of his grades, but they didn't have the money. So he went to Willamette University and also graduated student body president, and then asked his uncle essentially what he should do. And his uncle, who was a builder, an architect, or just a contractor at the time, said, "You should be a doctor or a lawyer because those are the only 2 professions you'll make money at." And my father went to medical school and went on to create an amazing career in OBGYN. He helped pioneer a lot of, things like reconstructive pelvic, surgery laparoscopically. Him and his partner created Oregon's first women's healthcare clinic. And he met my mother, whose family also, so my mom's family is of Irish descendancy, and she was born and raised in Pasadena, California. But they would come up to Oregon to camp on an annual basis because her dad just fell in love with the Pacific Northwest, and he eventually relocated. He relocated their family to Eugene, Oregon, and so they met. She was in nursing school; he was a young doctor, and they had an amazing medical private practice together for their entire career. He was the surgeon, and she was his nurse, and so. A real storied career here in Portland, Oregon, and
pretty notable pretty notable dude, right? I
Yes,
mean,
and
obviously, a brilliant guy from day one.
brilliant guy. Great American dream story. And we were raised in Portland, Oregon, during the 70s and 80s and 90s, and what a great town to grow up in. But
Mm,
when I was growing up, there was this kind of cultural renaissance happening in Portland that was also happening across the West Coast and East Coast, which was um, uh, mostly fueled by what Alice Waters and Jeremiah Tower had created at Chez Panisse and Stars and places like that down in the Bay
right.
Area. This new American cuisine, these ideas from Europe that started spreading. And so, we were leaving this era of frozen big box grocery stores, frozen foods, the Betty Crocker cookbook, things like that, and getting into this new era of, organic foods, farmers markets, brewers, bakers, butchers, fishmongers, etc. And I think that my dad saw that and wanted to get back to his agricultural roots in some way. And so in 1996, serendipitously found this amazing property in the Dundee Hills that at one point had been a hazelnut orchard, at one point had been a black walnut orchard, before that had been plums for prunes. Those are the three previous agricultural iterations of the Dundee Hills before grapes. And
Right.
they fell in love with this property, and my mom and dad bought it on the, right there on the spot, and had no inclination, I think, to plant a vineyard and start a winery. I think my dad wanted to plant some lingonberries, some
Right.
blueberries, just wanted to get into agriculture. And then quickly looked around and realized that the Dundee Hills was a thriving viticulture scene, and that's how it got started. We were city kids. We were born and raised in Portland, Oregon. We didn't even know where the Willamette Valley was or what it was.
When you
And
say
so,
city kids, Josh, when you say city kids, like in New York City, you either live in the suburbs or you live in the city. Were you living in the city or were you right outside in the burbs?
well, I mean, for those of you who visited Portland, it's a fairly
It's different.
forested town. It's a different
Right.
town. We didn't
Right.
grow up downtown, but we grew up,
Right.
5 minutes from
Close.
downtown. So no,
Right.
we weren't
Yeah.
we weren't out in Beaverton or Tigard or the suburbs. We grew up in Northwest
You were
Portland.
right
So
there.
yeah, exactly.
All right.
So
So here's what I want you to do. I didn't mean to interrupt. So that's sort of the foundation story of your parents and how you got there. Now, tell me about what age you were, when they bought the property, and then give me your trajectory.
yeah, so I mean, I always like to tell my mom and dad's story and my father's immigrant story because it does lay down the foundation. Now, that was a long time ago. My father's turning 90 years old, so
Wow.
he immigrated when he was 17. They're both retired now, but yeah. So I was 21 years old, and I was at the University of Oregon studying business when my father called me and said, "What if we started a vineyard together? And what if you helped us make wine?" And I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know how to answer that question because I don't remember wine being on the table regularly growing up.
Right.
My dad wasn't a big drinker.
Right.
Maybe
A
a
little
scotch,
curious.
maybe a
Right.
scotch, every week or something like that when I was growing up. So I remember hanging up that phone call and going to a local wine store in Eugene, Oregon, um, and buying a wine glass, a corkscrew, and a bottle of Christum Pinot Noir, and going back to my apartment. I was a senior in college, and opening it up
Was
and
what
tasting it.
was Christum random, or you knew of Christum?
It was random. I just asked for an
Okay.
Oregon Pinot Noir,
Okay.
and it's funny because, Steve Dorner and all the folks at the Gary family at Christum have become good friends over the years.
I'm sure.
And Steve was a great mentor of mine. I never worked for him, but, respect him highly. But I remember, opening that bottle of wine and tasting it, and I called my father back and said, "Yeah, I'd love to do this." And we started this great family adventure of really having to educate ourselves on everything. I mean, I voraciously bought and read every book that the University of California Davis bookstore had for sale. Right. At that time, there was a magazine called Practical Vineyard and Winery, and in the back was this little tear out postcard from the UC Davis bookstore, and you could check the boxes of everything you wanted to buy and mail it to them, and they would send you books. And so I opened the Yellow Pages because we still use the Yellow Pages, and I called the first winery that I found, which was Rex Hill, and I talked to Lynn Penerash on the phone because she was the winemaker at the time, and she hired me on the phone and said, when can you get up here? This was for the 1997 vintage. And I took fall semester off that year, and I worked with Lynn and her team at Rex Hill, and I worked for 6 months at Rex Hill. I went back to school and graduated, and then I worked for the Ponzi family. And during this time, between the 97 and 98 vintage, when I was still an undergraduate, my dad would drive down and pick me up in Eugene, and we would drive all night down to UC Davis, and we would take extension classes in viticulture and enology. And and then he would drive me up on Sunday and drop me off on campus, late, and I'd go back to school. And we did like 6 or 7 of these trips together, and they were these wonderful father and son voyages where we talked about, starting a business. What would it be like? What if it didn't work out? All those things, but it was so exciting. And when I graduated, and then I finished the 98 vintage with Ponzi, I was kind of stuck in a weird place because I had a Bachelor of Arts because I ended up graduating as a humanities major. So I didn't have a wine degree. I didn't have a Bachelor of Science. So I couldn't go to Davis or Cal Poly or Fresno because I didn't have a science degree. I would have had to redo my degree to get into those graduate programs. And Luisa Ponzi said, why don't you just move to Burgundy and do a postgraduate program in Beaune? And I was like, is that a thing? Can you do that? And she said, yeah, I mean, there's a program. She had done it. And some of my other friends, like Thomas Batchelder, who makes wine in Canada and Burgundy, did it. And she said, but there's one prerequisite is that you have to be fluent in French because it's taught in French. And I said, well, that's crazy because I am fluent in French because, my parents had put us through bilingual education from kindergarten on, and we didn't know why. Wow. I mean, my brother and I were fluent in French. It's like we spoke some secret language because my parents didn't speak French. We didn't have any French friends, but they had put us through French schooling our whole lives. We were fluent in French. And all of a sudden this door opened and I was able to move to Burgundy and study viticulture and enology. And that's what I did. And I met my wife there, Caroline, who's from Beaune. She's born and raised Burgundian. And she was at the famous Lycée Viticole, also studying viticulture, enology, and wine and spirits marketing. And we met and fell in love. And we moved back as young kids and started Bergstrom Wines with my parents. My father planted the first 8 acres of the Bergstrom vineyard in the Dundee Hills while I was studying. And we came back and we were the labor. I was the first tractor driver. We hand hoed the vineyard together. And that's how it started. That's what started our adventure.
That's a great story. The most touching part to me is that your dad, I guess his first thought was, let me call Josh and see if he wants to do this with me. It was nice.
Yes, it was very nice. And I was entrepreneurial as a kid. I had a landscaping company during high school. Like I had 100 yards that I shopped out with. I hired friends. And so I had this entrepreneurial spirit. But at the same time, my father has had 2 marriages. And so he has 2 families. We were all raised together. But my older siblings are all amazing professionals in their own careers. One of my sisters is, in the top 1% of realtors in America. One of my brother is a retired judge who worked for the DA's office for many years. And then I have a sister who is a retired top, pharmaceutical CEO or chief pharmaceutical officer. So, and then I have a brother who's a musician. So I think that the timing was right that my dad asked me if I wanted
But
to do this.
process of elimination where you were the right person too, you know? So,
Yes,
but still,
yes.
I'm pretty sure it was the same sentiment. Look backwards a second for me, and then, we're going to move forward. I'm just curious, what was going on wine wise, in Oregon and the Willamette Valley, like in 96 when your dad was starting and when you got back.
Yeah.
And your dad had already planted, the 8 acres. I mean, were there, obviously even before that, you were working at real name wineries. What was going on there?
So the wine scene at that time was obviously much smaller than it is today.
Right. But there was a
Chardonnay.
scene.
Absolutely there was a scene. I mean, we're bonded winery, 240 plus. So I mean, but now there's over like 900 brands in the Willamette Valley. So, you know, if you want to call us the sophomore or junior class, because I think we were part of the third wave, as they call it. The first wave would have been the pioneering families, the Letts, the Adelsheims, the Ponzis, the
Right.
Sopaglossers, the Campbells, et cetera, et cetera. ERAF. The second wave would have been, Domaine Drouin, Argyle, Chehalem, a lot of great wineries that came in during that time. We were the third wave. So, Bergstrom, J.K. Carrier, Jim Prosser, Jimmy Brooks.
Right.
There were several kind of younger brands that started in that era. So we were still looking to the pioneering families for inspiration and guidance. Right after we started, Oregon Pinot Camp was founded. The International Pinot Noir celebration was going full bore at that point. So yes, it was a thriving industry when we started. But and I should say that our very first harvest we made with purchase fruit from Archery Summit. Gary Andrews at the time it was
Right.
very kind, and Sam Tannehill, his winemaker, sold us fruit. We were working for Eric Hammerker and made wine at the brand new Lemelson, facility. So there was a lot of things happening. There were a lot of new labels popping up, and we were part of that and part of that generation. Um,
Was it
and
an open community? I mean, everybody kind of shared and helped. It sounds like it.
it was, and it still is.
Right.
That is by far one of the most amazing parts of this corner of the world, viticulturally and enologically speaking, is that the Willamette Valley is. I mean, some people don't want to use the word community because that, the community says a lot of things that maybe it isn't
Right.
100% that, but it is definitely a group of professionals that share, that exchange, that work together, that brand together, that travel together, that sell together. We were able to overcome so many potential pitfalls in our early years because older winemakers chose to share information with us, to give
Right.
us, to lend us a hand,
Right.
to lend us a tractor if ours broke down, to sell us some fruit if we needed it. The Oregon wine community has always been there for each other, and that was true then, and it is today as well. And that's why this is such a thriving hotspot for young winemakers, because they can really come up through this industry fairly quickly and learn a lot, because there's so much information, so much oral history, so much written history that is just freely shared. It's open for
Yeah.
everyone to access.
I'm so glad to hear that because, that seems to be going on everywhere. But, the community has to be open to it. So, it sounds to me like, back then, nobody was making bad wine. I mean, you look at other regions and there was a lot of commodity crap or guys who didn't care about, how they were farming or making wine. Was that an issue then? Were there little pockets of that or not really?
Well, I mean, so there's a reason that large, winemaking industrial complexes, if you were, have not moved to the Willamette Valley, and that is that we have a cool climate. We have a cool maritime climate that oftentimes, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, gave us challenging circumstances. So we know in the Pacific Northwest that the jet stream is going to sag and we're going to start seeing rain and cool and we're going to lose sunshine. So larger companies know that it's a liability. I mean, if you wanted to move to
Right.
Oregon and make and harvest 1 million tons of Pinot Noir, it's just not possible without a large percentage of that harvest sitting out in the rain. So that's why it's always been more conducive to smaller production facilities.
That's interesting. Separate the men from the industrial pussies, right?
Well,
Men and women, I mean.
So we farm 70 acres on 3 different appellations. They're all, Dundee Hills, Ribbon Ridge, Gila Mountains. I can see all of them from my window right here. They're all within about a 2-mile radius.
Wow.
My farming team and my production team can harvest all of our fruit if we needed to in 7 or 8 days.
Wow.
That would be a stretch. It wouldn't be easy,
right. But
we
doable.
could do it. But a large winery that wants to make 500,000 cases, 700,000 cases, 1 million cases, it's going to take them a month or more to harvest that much fruit, which means that you're guaranteed a certain part of your harvest is going to sit out in the rain and potentially be affected by rot or birds or other damage. So that's why you don't see very large wineries here. And so that's what keeps Oregon precious and niche, and I think very worthwhile of consumers' attention, because everyone who's an operator here has moved from somewhere to come here because they were passionate about Pinot Noir, because they're passionate about this climate. And for the most part, operations are small enough that you're guaranteed a fairly high level of quality coming out of this valley.
That's a good common thread. So, Oregon is having more than their moment as a great wine region. I mean, you're certainly there, and it's been like that way. And it's now considered one of the best places in the world to grow, and make Pinot Noir and Chard. And you've sort of laid out and said, the Willamette Valley is a great source of New World Pinot.
Absolutely.
How do you define, New World Pinot versus Old World Burgundy, which I think, you look towards Burgundy as an example, but how do you define it? And, is everyone making a little of both? They follow the Old World or they're doing New World stuff?
That's a good question, and it's a big talking point. I mean, when I was just in New York and showing our wines to sommeliers who have bought our wines for the last 25 vintages, when you talk about Pinot Noir, of course the word Burgundy pops up because Burgundy is reference standard. It's the birthplace of Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay have been grown there for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's so much history there, of course. What's important to say is that the Willamette Valley, and if we're talking about essentially like how David Lett might have thought about it when he was a student at University of California, Davis, and decided along with Charles Coury and Dick Erath and others to intentionally move Pinot Noir to this valley. I mean, they had other choices, but through their own studies and visiting Burgundy and tasting Burgundy, they believed that the Willamette Valley, north of the 45th parallel, in a cool climate, protected by a coastal mountain range from the Pacific Ocean and a eastern volcanic mountain chain, which protects us from the harsh interior of Oregon's high desert, which had fertile soils and rocky, well-drained mountain soils as one of the ideal places in the world to achieve a Willamettian style, if you will, of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which means that we lead with natural, vibrant, succulent acidities. There is a saline, salinity, maritime mineral influence, bright, fresh, floral and fruit characters. Nothing ever dried or tired or baked or stewed or fruit leathers, etc. Willamettian wines lead with the same positive attributes that Burgundian wines lead with. However, I think we can all agree that Burgundy's climate and soils is quite different than Oregon's Willamette Valley's climate and soils. However, when we put the wines side by side, we see a kinship in that we are leading with acidity. We are usually lower in alcohol than hotter climates. Good winemakers will be very judicious on oak usage and technique to really highlight the ethereal and the elegant, which is what this valley wants to produce, versus the large, dark, and extracted, which is not. That's just not what comes out of our climate. So I rarely ever, if never, use the word Burgundian in talking about my wines, but talking with sommeliers in New York and in other places, of course, customers will always bring up the word, I'm looking for something Burgundian, or I like Burgundian wines. We have to remember that Oregon as a state produces 1% of all American wine by volume.
That's
1%.
It?
1%. And Chardonnay.
Why am I even talking to you?
Exactly. We just wasted 30 minutes of your listeners' time. No, but and Chardonnay is less than 7% of what we make in the States. So we're talking about some of the most delicious, luxurious, rare, niche wines in America. And that's what makes it special. And that's why people love to talk about it and love to seek out Willamette Valley wines, is because of their rarity.
The 1% gets way more attention. Just tell me a few things. You sort of laid out that Willamettean style. You also said, you have vineyards in, sort of different, region, all you could see from your house. Is there, even though there's that style, is there a lot of variation, vineyard to vineyard or AVA to AVA, either because of exposure or altitude or whatever? I mean, do you really have an opportunity to, tweak the styles from, what the area gives you?
So Bergstrom Wines is celebrating its 25th vintage. That was back in 2023. So I've actually almost made 30 vintages here in the Willamette Valley, and I have worked with over 125 different vineyards in all appellations. I've worked with every clonal rootstock combination that this valley has that is planted. Absolutely, there is so much variation between, let's say, down near King Estate in Eugene, at the furthest south you can go in the Willamette Valley, all the way up to let's say up to where we are in the northern Chehalem Mountains, or Ponzi on the other side in Laurelwood, Eola Amity to Yamhill Carlton to McMinnville to Chehalem Mountains, Ribbon Ridge. Absolutely, and that's what we love. And winemakers gravitate towards this nerdy, geeky love of minutia, right? So different soils, different aspects, different elevations, different exposures, different clones, different rootstocks, and then of course vintage variation on top of that gives us this matrix or maze every year, this puzzle that we need to figure out. And that's what's so amazing about Pinot Noir in a cool climate, is we're trying to portray a house style, but then how do you do that with all of those variables that are thrown at you? That's the fun part. That's the game, is trying to present wines that are true to your brand, but also wines that are true to your region and climate, and then showcasing the positive attributes of a vintage.
Right. That's the way to do it. Before we take a quick break, I just had a couple more questions. So you said this is a cool weather growing region, which is ideal for what you guys are doing. Two questions. Because it's cool and, you mentioned more than a couple times, it's rainy there. Is it challenging as far as, trying not to use treatments or having to use treatments? And we'll talk about your biodynamics when we get back. That's the first question. The second question is, it's hard to not talk to wine people and not talk about climate change. Is that less of an issue because of the region and the climate you're dealing with?
So to your first question, I would say that in cool climates, a lot of vintages historically are a story about being somewhere between a rock and a hard place, right? There's always
Explain.
in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early aughts. Yes, rain, hail, spring frosts, bird pressure, mildew, botrytis, other factors, of course, but um, heat domes,
Right.
sunburn. There's so many things. There are so many variables that can affect
Jesus.
the positive attributes of a harvest. But that's what we do, right? That's why we're professional farmers
Right.
and professional winemakers, is learning. I think every year in my career, I've made one major mistake. Everyone does, and the goal of a winemaker is to learn from that mistake and never make it again. So
Right.
you can chalk it up. I've almost made 30 major mistakes in my career, vintage to vintage. But yes, things are changing. I mean, 5 to 6 of the hottest vintages we've ever seen in Oregon's history have happened in the last 5 to 6 years.
Right.
2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 5 of the hottest vintages we've ever seen. 23 that just happened, quite warm. I like to say that, of course, I believe in climate change, and of course, I believe in
Right.
global warming. In the Pacific
Right.
Northwest, we tend to say that it's global weirding because, although we are seeing a steady rise in annual growing degree days, we're also seeing phenomenon that we can't really prepare or forecast for, like late spring frosts or the 2021 heat domes, where the temperature in the Willamette Valley for a couple of days was 114 degrees.
Jesus.
We've never seen things like that. It's hard to prepare for those things. So I think that's our pressure these days: is what's next. What's going to happen. We know we're seeing warmer and warmer temperatures and
Right.
drier years. But every year now is presenting its own scenario that we are evolving with and learning how to deal with.
That's the variations are crazy, that you mentioned. All right, Josh, we're going to take a quick break. We're talking to Josh Bergstrom from Bergstrom Wines, out in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. When we come back, we're going to talk about your wines. We're going to talk about farming practices, cellar, and a bunch of other things. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
All right, we're back. We're back with my guest, Josh Bergstrom. Josh is the winemaker, proprietor of Bergstrom Wines in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Josh, let's talk about the wines and everything that goes into it. I was interested and curious about something you talk about, and walk me through it. It's the 1,000 days of effort, which you've titled or labeled, but obviously everyone sort of goes through it. Explain what that is.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. It's actually it's a phrase that I coined and then we trademarked, but because I think it's super important to how my team works. I am now actually director of winemaking, and my winemaker's name is Madeline Pasquarelli. My vineyard manager is Nick Giannopoulos. We have an amazing team. We farm our own grapes with our own farming team. We make our own wines with Maddie and Lauren and myself and our team. and then we market and we bring to market and sell our own wines. So what that means, that 1,000 days of effort, and that's the phrase that unites us as a team, is that it takes us 3 years to farm, produce, and bring a bottle of Bergstrom to market. And why that is important is that the farming and production and sales team need to be unified, because if the farming team brings a bad harvest to the production team, then the production and the sales team are in trouble. If the farming team brings a great harvest and the production team does a bad job, then the sales team is in problem. But if we can farm and produce great wines, we are giving our sales team a great opportunity to bring a fantastic product to market. And so that's how we think about things, is that every single bottle is 3 years of effort, 1,000 days of effort, and we're all working united to bring great wines to market. Because you have to remember that, like, right now, we are starting the farming process. We've been pruning now for 2.5 months on the 2025 vintage. We are aging the 2024s. We are bottling and selling the 2023s. In market are the 2022s. And anyone who's bought a bottle of Bergstrom wines, because we make them to age, is contacting us constantly about every vintage from 2021 back to 1999. So we are always living and working with multiple vintages at the same time. And it may sound a little daunting to an outsider, but when you're in the wine industry, you understand that very well. And that kind of dynamic relationship with wine is fascinating, and it's why we love it. And no one ever starts the next vintage like, oh gosh, here we go again, another everyone is excited for what this year's opportunities will be.
It sounds like the right way to do it. You've committed to thoughtful farming, I guess, pretty much from the beginning. I mean, you've been practicing biodynamics. I'm just curious, what initially encouraged you, your dad, I mean, you were pretty much together at the beginning, to farm this way? Was that a norm with all the people we talked about earlier? Did somebody influence you? Because a lot of people are doing it, not sure how many, around you, but not everyone. So, why did you begin to practice biodynamics? And then I think, you kind of even practice regenerative farming, which we could talk about if that's true. But tell me about the biodynamic part.
So in full transparency, I came to biodynamics in a selfish way. I was a student in Burgundy. My wife's father played tennis with Pierre Moret, who was the original régisseur at Domaine Le Fleuve. I was very lucky to meet Pierre several times and taste wines and talk with him. He's, him and Anne Claude were some of the original biodynamic practitioners on the Côte d'Or. And and that inspired me, and I saw other great domains doing biodynamic practices. And so when I say I came to it selfishly, my father had put me in charge of learning how to make wine and making wine, which was a great honor, but also fairly daunting. And I wanted to do my best. And so I just thought, if biodynamics makes my wine even 1% better, I'll do it. I don't care what it is. I'll just do it. And that's how I came to biodynamics. Now, once I started farming our vineyards, and I was the one spraying sulfur and spraying things in the vineyard, which we were biodynamic, from inception. But even just mixing organic certified chemicals and spraying them and having to wear a spray suit and a filter on your mouth, like a spray mask, it became very apparent to me that, we're making wines for family and friends and colleagues and things that we can age, that our children will drink on birthdays and anniversaries. And I changed my attitude. I mean, I didn't come to biodynamics as an ecological warrior, but, once I started working in vineyards, that's exactly how it shifted. Was, man, wine is a maceration product. There's only one ingredient. It's grapes. And if that ingredient is harboring chemicals like insecticides and herbicides and systemic fungicides and pesticides, not to mention NPK fertilizers in the soil. I mean, then it's not going to be a healthy product. It's not going to be a product of vitality. And that's really important for people to remember, especially with all this rhetoric right now that's going on about anti-alcohol and this kind of neo-prohibitionist talk that's going on out there. Fine wine should not be a part of that discussion. I mean, fine wine is a historical, cultural, agricultural pursuit that is, it's all about farming a fruit and then putting it through a very complex natural fermentation process to produce a beverage that has a lot of vitality and life force and cultural significance and so much importance in helping our region define its foods and how we evolve with those foods and with our environment. And so biodynamics and organics and now regenerative addresses that exact conversation of, look, we have men and women out in vineyards working, and it's our jobs to make sure they're not working in hot sun and without access to restrooms and water and shelter and breaks and we have people making wine, and it's important that they are having a positive experience and a healthy experience in the production of that wine. And then we want to be able to then, as a company that is working sustainably, to put out a product that is bringing life force and vitality and joy and health to people who want to enjoy it. So biodynamics has evolved a lot for me in that I first came to it in a kind of a selfish way, and now it is part of this holistic way in how we look at wine.
You seem to have all the, wine is more than the liquid in the glass. I appreciate the fact that you brought up people, and that you have to take care of your people, and, biodynamics helps with that. It's a whole big thing, and, you covered all of it or most of it, which is why you do it. But you're not the first person I've asked this to. I've asked it to a lot of my guests that farm biodynamically. I always ask, can you said that if it'll make the wine better, 1%, you're in, I get that. But can you sort of describe the effects of farming biodynamically, what effect it has on the wine? You always hear more lively or this or that, but how do you describe that practice and what it does to the wines?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I can answer it in a way.
But what you think? Yeah.
I don't.
Not give me your best shot. Give me any shot that comes through your mind.
Sure. We've always farmed biodynamically and organically, so we were never conventional. So I don't have I don't have a percentage for you of we used to do this and now it's 20% better or anything like that.
That's nerdy too.
It is.
We don't need to get too nerdy.
So we don't have a control, if you will. We've just always farmed that way and believed that way. What I can tell you is that when you walk into our vineyards, they're noisy. They're noisy in that you hear birds, you see life. There are birds because there are rodents. There are snakes because there are rodents. There are insects. There are butterflies. There are dragonflies. There are ladybugs. For as monoculture as a vineyard is, there is polyculture in our vineyards and surrounding our vineyards because we are promoting life. Now, I can tell you for a fact that I've walked into so many conventionally farmed vineyards and there is no noise. They're not noisy vineyards. They're quiet. They're actually solemn because there are no birds, because there are no rodents. There are no snakes. There are no insects. Because everything's been killed. And
right, there are two words for that. Almost dead.
To walk into a conventional vineyard is like walking into a graveyard. And I don't want that to sound dramatic, but it's true.
True.
When you're in a biodynamic or organic or regeneratively farmed vineyard, there is life, and you can see it. You witness it, and the vines, if you will, have developed a certain tolerance to disease and other things in that they grow healthily. The leaves are a certain color of green. They are cupped looking up to the sun. They're not wilted and facing down to the ground. And we are seeing the vines actually react with the seasons, where spring growth should be as it should. In August, we're seeing lignification of all shoots and stem peduncles and early rachis, lignification. So we're seeing seed lignification the way that it should be at the right time. And for the most part, we're seeing chemistries that are as we would like them to be, given our soils and this region. So all I know is that we have happy vines, happy chemistries, happy musts, and pretty temperate fermentation. So I'm happy. The wines are happy. They taste great. I could tell you that they have an energy and a vivaciousness and a vitality, but that would just be subjective. I don't have a laboratory to back me up on any of that, of course. But then again, wine is subjective, and so if we feel good about making it and we feel good about drinking it, then we're happy the way that we're farming it.
Well, listen, two things that are very important to my listeners is lignification and peduncles, but we will move on. So we talked about, and everyone says, wine is as good as, what comes out of the vineyard. Talk to me a little about cellar practices, this whole non-industrial biodynamic, natural way of making wine. You could do all of that and then get in the cellar and screw it up. Tell me just some of the things you're doing in the cellar to sort of, protect, everything you're doing.
So on the biodynamic calendar, which we follow a lunar calendar, it's ideal to harvest and to rack and to bottle on lunar days that are beneficial for wine. I find that wine for me tastes best as we're heading into a new moon versus heading into a full moon. Now, I don't think I think it's important to qualify that it's not the wine that tastes better during those phases of the moon. It's actually how our human bodies are open to or reacting with certain things during certain phases of the moon. So I think
that's a good point.
I think that I, as a human being, am more receptive, organoleptically speaking, to wine as we're heading into a new moon. Fruit, flower, root, and leaf days. I think that's quite interesting. We've followed the Maria Thun calendar for 25 years. I think that there's enough knowledge there to stand by the fact that there are certain days of the month during lunar cycles that planting or sowing or reaping is the right thing to do. So in the cellar, but I've also had biodynamic people tell me, people who've been in biodynamics for a very long time, that biodynamics is an agricultural process. It's not a winemaking process.
Right.
As if biodynamics ends the moment you harvest fruit.
It's
because
a handoff.
Essentially it's a handoff. But so we do our best in the cellar to still follow lunar phase when we're talking about harvesting, racking, and bottling. But in the winemaking process at Bergstrom Wines, we're quite natural in the sense that, we're fermenting, we're aging, we're trying to use as less amount of new oak as possible. We're using all French oak. We're not using any concrete or eggs or things like that at this moment. And the aging process is quite normal, and it's about a year for Pinot Noir, 18 months for Chardonnay. We're trying to keep our dissolved carbon dioxide levels, so that the gas that's natural in wine that's produced from alcoholic fermentation or malolactic fermentation, we're trying to keep that quite high so that we can keep our sulfur levels lower. So we're trying to go to bottle with a fairly high level of dissolved gas, so that we can keep our sulfur levels at below 40 parts per million. And so what that means is, to your listeners, is wine has a few layers of protection against oxidation. Wine is like the human body. Wine is like everything on the living planet, in that oxygen will eventually kill us all, right? So our heart beats and breathes, and we bring oxygen into our blood. But after a certain many years on this planet, we oxidize. We breathe too much oxygen, and all of our organs oxidize, and we die. That's the same thing with wine, is that wine will absorb oxygen and over time will die. Our job as a winemaker is to take a juice to a delicious place somewhere between juice and vinegar, and then protect it from oxygen. And so dissolved carbon dioxide gas, which is naturally produced from fermentations, is the first layer of defense against oxygen. The second layer of defense is going to be sulfur dioxide that's added as potassium metabisulfite in very small parts, less than breakfast cereals and dried fruits, to also protect that wine. And then our third layer of defense is going to be the polyphenolic structure, tannins, et cetera, of a wine. Once those three are accessed by oxygen, then wine will start its decay process. So our cellar process is quite natural, and we're just trying to take the most delicious bottle of wine to bottle, about 1 year to 18 months after harvest. I'm not adverse to filtration if needed, only because, I don't drink French press coffee. I drink filtered coffee. That I don't like to take cloudy or chunky wine to bottle. So we will do the most settling we can in tank, and then we do a lot of laboratory analysis to make sure it's stable microbially. And then if we need to do a polishing filtration, I'm not adverse to that. I actually think it's quite finer for the consumer than to actually take lees to bottle. So
let's talk about some of the wines specifically, and let's talk about some of the vineyards. You kind of mentioned this earlier. I mean, I know vintage and site dictates, the wines, and you may have said this, but let's go over it again. Is there a Bergstrom style, even though every variable that we've talked about for the last, almost hour can have an effect on it? Is it that high natural acid? I mean, what are you happy achieving every time?
There is a Bergstrom style, for sure. It's always evolving. And that's the interesting thing about wine, right? I mean, we're not making Pepsi or Coke or beer. We're not brewing on a regular basis,
or even some Napa cabs that taste the same.
Yeah, we have one chance a year to make a product. We want it to have a familiarity to our consumers and to our team. That is a Bergstrom wine. However, if you were to taste the wines that I made from 1999 until, let's say, 2008, they're very different than what we're making today. So you can imagine my father, this American dream story, and my mother cashing in their retirement to plant our first vineyard, and then them slapping me on the back and saying, "Good luck, son, make some great wine." Right? There's a fair amount of pressure there to succeed. So what did I do? I did what a lot of young winemakers did, which is try to make very impactful wines that will get the attention of critics. And so in the early days, I made darker, more extracted wines. They were higher in alcohol. They were higher in oak usage. I did everything I could to make very compelling wines that would capture the attention of the Robert Parkers and the Wine Spectators and the Steve Tanzers and the critics of the time.
Right. So you were pandering to the likes and styles of those times.
Well, I was also young, and so I enjoyed very impactful wines.
I mean, I'll yell at you later, but I won't yell at you now for doing that. I get it.
Yeah. So, but as my wife and I were working together and tasting our wines, which we are still very proud of, there's nothing wrong with those wines. It's just that we were drinking different things, and we found that our wines weren't aging the way that we wanted them to. And I decided that it was time to change our style. Now, I didn't, reach out to the New York Times or any other paper and say, all of my old wines are terrible and I'm changing my style. What we did was we just slowly started taking people on a journey. together as we evolved as human beings. Because, a lot of people ask me, what's new at Bergstrom Wines? What are you doing these days? And, the funny thing is that my wife and I were raised on the classics, and we cut our teeth on classic wines. And so our vision, our goal for our company is that at the end of our lives or at the end of our careers, people can look at our evolution as two human beings managing a team working with 5 estate vineyards. And the evolution of our wines will tell people the evolution of our lives. And so we started to evolve and get older and liked certain things better than other things. And so Mother Nature gave us the gifts of 2010 and 2011, which were very cold vintages. And so everyone made leaner wines that year because there was no sunshine. And I used those 2 vintages as a jumping off point to change our style drastically. And so we lowered the oak usage. We increased the whole cluster percentage. We went from extraction to maceration. We did cooler fermentations. We barely do any punch downs anymore. It's really gentle pump or bucket work. And we've taken people on a very slow but steady journey to the style where we are now. And so, yes, there is a Bergstrom style of Pinot Noir. We want to focus on the floral, the fruited, ethereal aromatics, the elegance of wine. We love very complex layered textures. We're not looking for dark purple wines. We're not looking for high alcoholic wines. We do not want oak to be the number one thing that you smell in our wines. And we want wines that age. We want them to go with our region's food. We want them to be Willametian. And we want them to age well. We want people to be able to drink them for the next 3, 5, 7, 10, 15 years. And that is the Bergstrom style.
So, I mean, that's impressive. I mean, it's who wouldn't want to drink a wine like that? So you execute that through different vineyard sites, the Dundee Hills, Ribbon Ridge, the Willamette AVA. I always have trouble pronouncing this, Josh. Set me straight. It's Chelam. How do you pronounce it?
Chehalem.
Chehalem. I wasn't even close. The Chehalem Mountains. So those are your 70 acres of your estate vineyards, and wines come from each of those. Now, that gives you the opportunity to do what you just described with a little different expression, from site and all of that stuff. I mean, is that the luxury you have with the way, the vineyards are set up?
The luxury that we have, which is quite different than what you would find in Burgundy, is that all of my vineyards that we farm, are anywhere between 13 and 22 acres. So those are fairly large holdings, which means each of those vineyards will give us anywhere from 10 to 20 different fermentations a year. So we are able to harvest multiple clonal blocks at different times from every vineyard. The Bergstrom style is to harvest every vineyard 3 times. So we will do an early, crunchy, bright, vibrant pick with very, very low alcohols. We will do a pick in the middle of harvest, which is kind of the tenderloin period of every harvest where the sugars are going to be a little bit higher. And then we do a later pick of all of our vineyards where those are going to be mostly the older vines and primarily the Pommard and Batensville clones, which are also going to bring in some savory, some saline, some mineral. And then we're able to blend in the cellar those 3 picks together to gather balance.
Who showed you that? Josh, who showed you that? Who taught you that? It sounds kind of brilliant.
Well,
it's almost like champagne. You farm that vintage, but you blend, years to, make better or whatever. Where did that come from?
The Bergstrom style, I mean, the fermentation technique and the harvesting technique that we implement now is just what has evolved with us over time. It's what we've decided to do. It's what works best in our cellar. Now, I don't want to make it sound like some genius maneuver, because at the same time, Bergstrom Wines, if you've ever been here, is a very small facility, and we don't have enough space to ferment all of our food at the same time. So it's actually come out of a more functional, it's not necessarily this genius concept that I made up. It's that
form and function.
We have to use every tank 2 or 3 times. And so it's just evolved with our size and actually has worked out to our benefit as far as style goes.
Yeah, it does sound, kind of brilliant, and it gives you, some good leeway to, make the wines.
Now
Um,
you talked about all of our different sites, and what's really important to mention is that we put all of our vineyards through the exact same winemaking lens, which is whole cluster fermentation. Now, some people will do some whole cluster, some destem. We are trying to, if we can, in any given year, put all of our vineyards through the same lens of whole cluster fermentation, because then you can see the true terroir differences. If I was to show you 5 of my wines and say, well, this one was 100% destem, this one was 100% whole cluster, this is 100% oak, and I mean, those stylistic approaches would make those all taste different. What we are trying to do once fruit is harvested and brought to the winery is treat them all exactly the same, so that the differences in our wines end up being, which is really fun to see, it's this vinous roadmap to the northwest corner of the Willamette Valley. All of these vineyards taste and smell extremely different, but it's not because what we did to them. It's we're putting them all through the same lens of fermentation the same way, so that you can taste the differences between the Ribbon Ridge, Chehalem Mountains, and Dundee Hills, even though these 3 appellations are just a mile or 2 apart.
Yeah. I want to ask you about another thing that you do, and that's make Syrah. We know that Burgundy, Oregon, the main deal is Pinot and Chardonnay. There's some good white wines being made out of other than Chard there. But tell me about Syrah. My understanding is you make it in Oregon, but you're making it in Washington State and California. Why Syrah? Is that like a side obsession of yours? And why'd you go out of state if in fact that's true?
So side obsession would be an understatement.
Okay, I nailed it.
Yeah, I love Syrah. It's one of my favorite things in the world to drink. Syrah is just such a spectacular varietal. It's able to achieve what Pinot Noir cannot, and vice versa. Pinot Noir, and that's why they have a symbiosis. That's why I believe that Pinot Noir and Syrah should always be on the table together. So when I was 20, I lived in Lyon, France for a year. I was an undergraduate student, and I was at a business law school in Lyon. And that's where I was first introduced to the Rhone Valley and the Beaujolais and Burgundy and all of that. But what's really, I think, interesting to me is, Lyon as the culinary capital of France. Unlike when you're in Burgundy and you look at a wine list, it's all Burgundy. When you're in Bordeaux and you look at a wine list, it's all Bordeaux. When you're in Lyon, every wine list has Syrah, Viognier, Aligoté, Chardonnay, Gamay, Pinot Noir, essentially all of the varietals that are grown in that area. It's an old Roman crossroads, and so it faces the Rhone to the south and the Beaujolais and Burgundy to the north, and so all of those varietals are enjoyed at the table with Lyonnais food. And so that's where I fell in love with Syrah. I've always loved Syrah. Now, when we started Bergstrom Wines in the 90s, it was fad and fashion, especially coming out of northern parts of California, to doctor up Pinot Noirs with Syrah. And so I never wanted to make Syrah on the Bergstrom label, because I didn't want to be accused of putting Syrah into our Pinot Noirs. Especially in the early days when I made pretty, larger bodied Pinot Noirs. But, once we started making this elegant style of Pinot Noir, where there's absolutely no question, it's 100% Pinot Noir, 100% from the Willamette Valley, I felt very comfortable in asking my wife and my family for the permission to make Syrah. And so we created a new label. It's called Gargantua. We've been making it for 14 years. And it is Syrah, 100%. And I started off, to your point, doing a West Coast examination of Syrah. So the early days of Gargantua were from Bien Nacido in California.
Pretty good site.
An amazing site. Chris Hamill and his team down there. I love those people so much, and so many great years working with them. A great site in Santa Maria. And then I worked with Greg Harrington and the team up at Gramercy Cellars, and we worked with Les Collines Vineyard out of Walla Walla. And then in Oregon, we've worked with multiple different sites from the Willamette Valley to the Columbia River Gorge to the Rogue and the Umpqua in the south. And so the idea was to show to American wine consumers what West Coast Syrah tastes like, because I think California, Oregon, and Washington are all making very, very exciting versions of Syrah. And so that was my goal, was to make Syrah from each of those states. Now, as time progressed, people loved the California and they loved the Washington, but they wanted to know about Oregon. You tell me about Oregon Syrah, because you're from Oregon, right? And what makes Oregon Syrah differently? And so we decided to abandon the California and the Washington Syrahs and focus on Oregon exclusively, because that's the state we're living in. That was in the year 2020, right when COVID
so
started.
Fairly recent.
Yeah, fairly recently. So now we are only making an Oregon Syrah. And we used to work with 6 or 7 different vineyards across the state, which was very exciting for a long time. But the problem is, we had a vineyard sell. We had a vineyard that was seeing smoke taint every year. We had another vineyard that it was too unpredictable, and we had a lot of change. And so we decided to just narrow it down. And now we are working exclusively with Jason Cole in Southern Oregon. He's just outside of Ashland, Cole Family Vineyard. He planted a Syrah and Viognier co-plant for us exclusively. And so now Gargantua is coming 100% out of that vineyard in Southern Oregon. Yeah.
Nice. I'm just curious, personal preference. Do you admire most or top of the list Rhone Syrah varietals?
Of course. I mean, just like Burgundy being reference standard for Pinot Noir, the Rhone is reference standard for Syrah. Now, that being said, I think some of my biggest inspirations for Syrah, of course, there's, great producers, Jean-Louis in Hermitage and Saint-Joseph, and Gonon and
I love Gonon.
and Almond, and all, you could go on and on about the Rhone. Yeah. But some of my great friends in California, Pax, and Sashi and Adam Tolmack at Ojai, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that the California scene, Melville, Coupe, there are so many Syrahs coming out of California from friends
doing a good job.
that are thrilling. They're thrilling wines. And when I ask them, I want to make Syrah and I love your style, a lot of times the answer was, well, good luck selling it. And I thought that was a shocking statement, because how can you make wine that is so delicious and have trouble selling it? And the problem is, of course, that the American consumer, remembers this kind of industrial blueberry syrup Syrah that was made. But when you get a peppery, savory, meaty Syrah, from a good producer who knows what they're doing on the West Coast, it's a thrilling bottle of wine. And I wanted to be a part of that story.
A guy like Pax he just started making wine at a new vineyard, outside of his pack, the Halcon vineyard, which is exciting to see guys who are passionate about it, continue to expand. All right, we got to wrap up. Just a couple more questions, then we want to do the wine list. We talked about a little earlier. New winemakers coming in. So there's definitely new blood in the area. Are people looking to other varietals? Basically, you and I talked about Pinot, Chard, and we discussed Syrah a little. Let's not get into Oregon, but at least in the Willamette Valley, are people looking to experiment, try, grow other stuff?
The answer is, I think, yes. And the reason is...
Is it conducive?
Well, I think that a good friend of mine, Harry Peterson Nedry, said recently that, the story may not be exclusively that Oregon is the perfect place to grow Pinot Noir. The story may actually be that Oregon is the perfect place to grow fruit. And I think in a way that is correct, in that our climate is perfectly conducive to creating bright, snappy, fresh flavors that lead with acidity. So although Oregon Pinot Noir is the story here, and it is what drives the bus, I mean, it is still the majority of the
Right.
conversation by far. I mean, you and I would not be talking today if it wasn't for Oregon Pinot Noir.
Right.
That yes, absolutely, that the Willamette Valley can ripen to perfection many other varietals, whether they're Alsatian, whether they're from the Loire, whether they're from the Alps, Burgundian, Beaujolais, etc. Um, our climate is conducive to producing great fruit. Now, I will say this. When I was a kid and Caroline and I were young people coming up through this industry, it was actually attainable and affordable to drink and taste the classics on a regular basis. We had
Right.
generous friends. We had generous friends who would open great bottles of wine. So we were able to taste what, Romane Conti and Henri Jaillet and Angelo Gaia, and you name, Leroy
Right.
Bise. We could taste those wines on a regular basis. And that's why we make the wines we make, because we were raised on the classics. Now, kids these days, young sommeliers and young
Right.
winemakers, those wines are prohibitively expensive. They're hard to access. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay fruit is very expensive. It's hard to get into some of the more famous vineyards up here now. I mean, it's an expensive game, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay winemaking. So what is their alternative? Well, their alternative is to make themselves known, make a name for themselves by using other varietals that are maybe more accessible, more easy to taste, more easy to wrap an identity around. So I have nothing against. I mean, I am always encouraging young folks to get into Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and keep this history rolling, which of course they are doing. But it's not unreasonable nor unfamiliar to see young people these days making Chenin Blanc, making Gamay, making Carbonic Barbera,
Right.
making whatever. I mean, because they're just trying to make a brand and make a name for themselves, and they're trying to be able to access things that they can afford.
I'm anxious and curious to see, how that plays out and taste the wines. Lastly, I know your wife's been at your side through this whole adventure back to bone. Kids, are they working with you?
Yeah, so Caroline and I, so Caroline has managed the business with me side by side for 26 years now. She manages our entire sales side as well as many other things. We raised two boys. So Baptiste, our oldest, is 23. He leaves tomorrow for New Zealand. He's going to go do harvest at Peregrine in Central Otago. So
Oh, wow.
he is definitely he loves wine. He's worked with us since he was a kid. He's done many harvests here, and I think now it's piquing his interest. He just graduated University of Oregon with a business degree, but he's going to go do the endless summer and do a harvest and see how that works out. Our youngest is an art student in New York, and so he's 18, and I don't know if wine will ever
Is
be his
he
thing, but
is he in college in New York
yes,
or?
he's in college. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So anyway,
well,
our boys are now young adults, and I guess Caroline and I are now what you would call empty nesters, which
right.
is kind
Well,
of
that's why she made you come home.
yeah. Well, that's our
Right.
next adventure together. So that's
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
awesome.
Well, it all sounds good. All right. Before we end the show, I mentioned to you that we do the wine list. I ask you 5 questions. I've asked these same 5 questions to our almost 300 guests on our past almost 300 shows. Be spontaneous. Don't dwell on these. Our listeners, after hearing the interview, love to hear what guys like you are drinking. So the first question is, what are you drinking now? What's in Josh's fridge? What's Josh and Caroline drinking at dinner outside of tasting for the winery or tasting your wines? Tell me what you're drinking now.
Number one answer would be champagne.
Okay, I'm right with you there. Can you tell me some preferences? Is it growers, the big lay? You're a Krug fan. Tell me some stuff that you like.
Yeah, I mean we're big fans of course the Krug, Cristal. The Roederer wines are top notch. Dom Perignon.
Yes.
But then, of course, growers. I mean, gosh, yes, how many? I mean, what's amazing about the Portland market is that there's our distributor here is called Galaxy. And they're a Wilson Daniels owned, but they have such an enormous list of grower champagne. So,
So
whether
you
it's
have access.
Mark Hebrard or
Right.
Delamotte Salon or Gaston Chiquet or I mean, we could go on and on.
Those
Jacques
that's
Lassagne, there's too many to mention, but we love champagne, which of course Pinot Noir and Chardonnay driven. Also love some Meunier champagnes, but yeah, that's what
right.
we love to drink.
All right, I'm with you there, and I think in the years ago I'd say, well, what else besides champagne? Champagne is fine for me. Only champagne. All right, second question. And I think you're a foodie too. Favorite wine and food pairing? Kind of the goofiest question. Not what you and I think is the best wine and food pairing. What is your wine? What's your ooh and ah? What do you like? Obviously, you probably don't eat it, every week, month, but what's that
Well, I
classic
mean,
wine and
I think it would be very easy to say something like Barolo or Barbaresco and truffles, but that's not our region, right? So our
right?
region our region would be Dungeness Crab and Willamette Valley Chardonnay, or any Chardonnay that is high in acid and has that mineral with Dungeness Crab, which is Dungeness crab. For those of you who have not tried it, that's what we're famous for here in the Pacific Northwest. We don't have we don't have the stone crab, the blue crab,
Right.
the king crab, but the Dungeness crab is so meaty, and we can just drive out. I'm actually going with some friends in a couple of days. We're driving out to the coast. You stand out on the dock, you open some champagne, you drop a crab pot, and you just pull up Dungeness crabs, and
That's it. That
it's
sounds
ideal.
like a good time.
Yeah.
Champagne and crabs that you call yourself. Now, I'm just curious. Like in Maryland, they pour a lot of Old Bay seasoning. Do you just basically pull the crab, boil it, and eat it?
Yep.
Just the
Lemon.
fresh salinity of the meat.
Yep, just some lemon squeeze.
That's it.
I like to put a little homemade aioli on the side with some
Yeah,
good, bread. Yeah,
that's a preference thing, not a preparation thing. All right,
exactly.
third question. You travel a bit. I know you're not stuck, but you're there most of the time. Recommend to me some of your favorite wine restaurants and or bars. And this isn't a ranking or your favorites, because I don't want you to bump into a friend and say, why don't you mention my place? Just tell me some good places. Tell me some good places that do it well. Great lists, great vibes, nice
Yeah,
people. Some are
sure.
just bars, good food. What comes to mind? Anywhere in the
Okay, so
world.
if you're coming out to wine country, Pinch Restaurant, which is run by my good friend and great chef Paul Bachon and his wife Emily.
Good one.
Hi-Fi Wine Cellar. Also, the Allison Inn and Spa has a great restaurant called Jory. And then a great friend of mine, awesome chef, the Painted Lady restaurant, if you like more kind of a white tablecloth dining experience. Now, if you're going to
Ah,
go to Portland, you cannot go to Portland without eating at Le Pigeon or Canard. So Le
okay.
Pigeon, Gabriel Rucker, and my good friend Andy Fortgang have a great couple of restaurants right there. They have a great wine store called Floor. Just up from Floor would be a great wine bar called Arden. And then Ox Restaurant in Portland is fantastic. If I talk much longer, I'll probably piss off a bunch
No,
of people.
stop
But
there.
those are all great places.
That is the quickest unload, the most information, concise, and just from the brief descriptions, these sound like as good or the best places around. So, and I post all of this stuff. So, that's the whole idea was, listen, you live there, you make wine there, you eat there, what's good there, so that's why we do this. All right. That's the third question. Here's the fourth question. Favorite all-time wine. Now, before you answer, my initial intent on this question was, hey, Josh, what's the rarest, most expensive wine you ever drank? Don't care about that anymore. Tell me about that wine in all your days in wine that opened your eyes, that changed the way you thought, that is memorable, important to you. Is there a wine or two that fits that category?
There's a wine that I've had about 6 or 7 times in my life that I always go back to and have loved from the first time I ever tasted it. And that is Domaine Leflevre 2004 Les Pucelles. And it's just one of the most magical Chardonnays I've ever had. I've had it 6 or 7 times over many, many, many years. And every time, even to this day, now 20 years later, it continues to just be magical. Now, of course, it's very hard to find now, but if
But
I
can you
ever see
find
it
a
on
bottle? Can
I
you
find
find
it
a
more
bottle
often
here
than
and
not
there?
in New York on restaurant lists.
Okay.
But yeah, it's still out there.
That's a good one. All right, here's the last question. Recommend to me best wine around 15, 20, 22 bucks. Recommend to me a red and a white. You can go category, like Muscadet in France is a pretty good wine for the money. You know, you don't have to name makers. You could do a category, you can name makers. And you can go anywhere in the world. You can go anywhere in Oregon. You could do any of your wines, which I'm not sure hit the $20 mark, $22. But give me some of your thoughts about, and this is a selfish question because I have kids in their late 20s and 30s. They can't show up at a party with a crappy bottle of wine, but they can't afford to spend 50, 60 bucks. So how do you bring a good gift or dinner, wine? That's a great
Well,
value.
it's a good question, and just to before I answer it, a lot of customers ask me, how come American wine isn't cheaper? Like, how come I can go to France or Spain or Italy and get wine for €5, and I can't do that in America? And the answer, just to make sure that people understand, is that it's not a selfish, like greedy, subjective. We want to be very, very expensive. Is that American wine, for the most part, is still first generation, meaning that most people had to buy the land, plant the vineyard, build the winery, essentially lay out all of the costs to create a business.
The initial investment. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's not until you get into the fourth, fifth, sixth generation, like many European wineries are, where you're able to offer wines at a more affordable cost because your margin is so much better. I mean, I have a friend who I met a long time ago who makes Cabernet Franc and Chinon, and his wine was like $8 a bottle, and he said
Unbelievable.
it only cost him $2 to make because he was the 10th generation. So that's of course a great ideal, and
It's
so
good
actually.
insight.
Loire Reds are a wonderful deal, or I should say value. And I also want to say something a retailer told me when I was a kid. One of the quotes that I will always remember, and that is, a great deal on a bad bottle of wine is not a great deal. And that's how we've always tried to approach wine, is that value means different things to different people. Value does not need to mean on sale or cheap. So value for me, when I'm looking for wine for everyday drinking, I'm thinking Italian reds, northern Piedmont. So I'm thinking like Dolcetto, Barbera.
Yeah.
I love, you said it. I was thinking about it when you said it. Muscadet. I love Muscadet.
Right.
There's nothing better with a plate of oysters than a great Muscadet.
I agree.
And so I think Northern Rhone Italian or Northern Italians, the Southern Rhone, just a great Côte du Rhone, a great Gigondas, delicious wines. Rosé from the south of France, whether it's like in the Cassis or Bandol area. I mean, some Bandols are pretty expensive, but rosé from the south of France is delightful. Chacolina, is a great wine.
You don't hear
Portuguese white wine, Vinho Verde, awesome, great wine. So that and
Josh,
Beaujolais, of course.
Josh,
Beaujolais.
you are the easiest guy to ask questions to. I mean, I have to pull teeth sometimes to get two answers. I don't know if I can fit all these in, but every one of those that you mentioned are terrific in the sense that it truly answers the question, and then even throwing some cool stuff like Chacolina or whatever. Portuguese is always a great value. All right. So as I mentioned, I post those answers on our social media. We do a Josh's Wine List post towards the end of our social media campaign. So keep an eye out on that. I want to do a quick wrap up, and then I want to get some info from you, and then we're out of here. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Listen to the Grape Nation podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe to the Grape Nation if you like the show and leave a review. Follow us on Instagram at @SBenRuby and on X @BenRuby. You can always use the hashtag The Grape Nation to find us on both. We are on Facebook at The Grape Nation. As I mentioned, we'll post Josh's wine list. I wish we were sitting together in New York because I would have posted our weekly wine sip selection is when we taste wine, but we'll do that another time, Josh. Josh, if people want more information on Bergstrom wines, buying it, knowing more about it, where to get it, what's the best place for them to go?
So our website, bergstromwines.com, that's BERGSTROMWINES, so wines plural.com is the best place to go. And we have a lot of great features like a chat feature, text feature if you need someone on our team to answer any questions you might have. And then we're on social media, Bergstrom Wines, and I'm on social media at Josh Bergstrom Wine, and Caroline is on social media at Caroline Bergstrom Wine. So, yeah, check us out. We
Are
love,
you fairly? Do you post regularly? Nobody likes to go to your Josh Bergstrom, and your last post was August 23. Do you post regularly?
I post regularly, but if you don't like to see pictures of miniature dachshunds taking naps, then don't follow me. So.
All right. I'm glad because obviously people understand the commitment that you make to these wines. How you farm and how you make them. It's a family estate, winery and vineyard. So we always want people to, be able to look for more information. All right, before we wrap up, this isn't irrelevant to what we've been talking about, but La Paule, our friends Daniel Johns, Raj Vadya, all those guys, the world's premier Burgundy wine event is back in San Francisco, February 27th through March 1st. They'll be at Blackberry Farm March 2nd through the 5th, and they're coming to New York March 5th through the 8th. Go to www.lapaule, that's LAPAULEE.com, for a list of the incredible tasting and events. It's always a great event. I want to thank our guest, Josh Bergstrom. I want to thank our engineer, Armin, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam Ben-Ruby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.